What do you think we do about this? How
Oh,
do we get past the word salad bar?
that's a really great term, by the way, the
The
word.
word salad bar? Because
Well,
that's
I
what our
mean, I
discourse
think
is.
the only thing that we can do, I think, is just try as best we can, kind of on an individual level, as participants in public discourse, to steer people away from being hung up on labels, And, again, the word feminist is a really good example. I mean, I tend to really avoid getting into debates on whether or not I call myself a feminist, whether or not I am a feminist. If you want to, challenge me as, as too feminist or, too anti-feminist, whatever. But again, address my ideas and what I'm actually saying. And,
I
you know,
personally, and maybe this is a bit of a radical streak on my part, but I kind of dismiss the whole argument of whether somebody is or is not a feminist as
yeah,
Marxist
yeah.
thought policing. It's who cares? Like,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
know, I can, it's so ridiculous to me when someone uses something as a shorthand, like, I'm a Canadian, I'm also a North American. One does not negate the other.
Right,
So
right.
arguing whether or not I'm a real Canadian, well,
Hmm.
if your citizenship says Canadian, you are a Canadian. But there
Hmm.
are some
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who talk about the Canadian identity and the real Canada, and this isn't a real Canadian value. And when you start intersecting identity with values, then you get this mess.
Oh,
And
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's it's a I've discovered it's a real impediment to communication because at least with me, where do I speak? Do I speak at feminist conferences where people say I'm not a real feminist and they can point to people on both sides of the aisle saying I'm not a real feminist, I'm just a dumb whore? Or do I speak at other conferences where they don't want me because they know platform feminists?
Right,
It's
right.
a real, it's almost stamping out moderation. And
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely,
you've had
absolutely.
issues
Yeah,
with
yeah.
people protesting you on campuses, and I
Oh, of
cannot
course,
understand this because
of
your
course.
stuff is, you argue things point by point, and I think you're an early third wave feminist in that, you know, you were writing in the 1990s where we actually were struggling with the changes in rape laws and what
Right.
that did. I mean, that was a very tumultuous period because it was a change.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I think of third wave feminism, I think of stuff like yours. You know,
Well,
this
it's
this
probably not how the term third wave feminism is commonly understood, but
which
again,
drives me crazy because
yeah,
it's just a point in time, right? It's just
yeah,
actions
yeah,
that happened during starting in around 88, 89 when we started having
yeah,
this
yeah.
discussion
Well,
about the
and
broadening of
actually, a
rape
lot
laws.
of the debates, like I look at my book, I look at my book, and it's just amazing how many of the debates were really kind of the same stuff that we're arguing about today, just at a different level, and partly because, we didn't really have the internet,
Yeah.
back then. It was sort of in its infancy. And, and it's funny because, some of these debates, were still like the definition of rape, and the definition of sexism, the gender differences. We're still dealing with a lot of the stuff, and obviously there's a lot going on that is new.
Now
um
you have an issue with the term rape culture as well, don't you?
yeah, yeah, and I think it's, well, again, kind of like with the term white privilege. I mean, I
That's what
think
I thought.
it is often seen as a kind of term that inherently attacks people, and it's a term that is seen as kind of being packed with this burden of guilt. I mean, it's really, for a lot of people, I think it is tantamount to saying, basically, like, well, men are rapists, or, all men are potential rapists.
See, this
Uh,
is where I see the term rape culture and the term white privilege as being separate, because white privilege was something that was sort of developed in academia. Rape
right.
culture was developed in protest culture. It's actually not, it's a term that
Sort
has
of. I mean, it
become
I mean, I think
technicalized.
it does have academic roots as well.
It's like
But
the Harley Quinn of academics. It's the only thing that started in the cartoon and ended up in the core comic books. It it started in campus activism. It didn't start because of,
well,
I believe the term was never intended, much like the male gaze, was never intended to be this be all and the end all of thought on the subject. It was a shocking comment that it was a focus, it was a lens,
right, right,
it was, oh, we're going to put a higher degree of magnification on this one issue,
right,
but
right,
it's not a legal principle.
right.
It's not something that you can define.
Right. Right. And partly, I mean, that's I guess what one thing that I would say is like, have there been like historically attitudes that were, condoning rape in certain situations? Sure, and not even that long ago. I mean, I think
Well,
that's very
I mean, that's undeniable
yeah,
since
yeah,
rape was only penetration with a penis.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
a guy being raped in prison with a broom handle, to be really evocative, would not be defined
Uh,
as rape.
yeah, yeah.
Now it is.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very true. And
Yeah.
but even so, I mean, I think even fairly recently we've seen, people tell jokes about prison rape. I mean, jokes about prison rape are seen as acceptable in a way that, jokes about
Not so much
the rape of
anymore.
women,
Yeah, it's funny that shifted
yeah,
because
yeah,
I know a couple of comic friends who had entire bits of their routine that dealt with prison rape. They can't do those
right.
anymore because it's considered homophobic.
Ah, so it's not because of the rape issue so much
It's
as because
criminalizing gay sex.
ah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
That's really I hadn't really thought of
which
that.
is
Yeah,
interesting because
yeah,
that
but
means
really,
we can't talk about the serious
yeah, that
phenomenon
is
of
bizarre.
prison
Yeah,
rape.
yeah, yeah. But I
You
mean,
know,
like even in terms of uh, within male female relations, you can see, for instance, in certain romance novels, you can certainly see like glorified rape scenes. I mean, I think that's undeniably true. Uh,
yeah, it's this is
and
why I
it
think
is kind of ironic that most of that those were primarily written by women. Like I was actually thinking, like the really pretty much all of the glorified rape scenes in literature really have been written by women. Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. The rape scene in The Fountainhead. Ayn Rand. I mean, a lot of that is really kind of the female fantasy rape,
see, I think
the
a lot of the
stuff.
fascination with male stories, because a huge bulk of the consumers of male romance stories are women.
Oh my
And
god, well, yeah, as somebody who does
yeah,
have experience in fandom, I can certainly confirm that.
but I think the
Male
appeal of
stuff
those
is
is you
huge.
can read a non-politicized romance. When both characters are male, we can
Right,
turn
right.
off the part of our brain that says, what does this mean about women? What does this mean about men? Where are the gender politics?
Yeah, I
And we
think
can
that
just
is
appreciate a love story between individuals.
right, right. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that is very true. But yeah, there's also, by the way, in fandom, there is a huge phenomenon of sort of rape fantasy fanfic. In the Xena fandom, there was a huge amount of like basically like Xena rapes Gabrielle and Gabrielle falls in love with her fanfic.
I think of all these cartoons we saw in the 80s where the one woman on the team is all chained up and doing this, and you will be forced to marry me,
Right, right,
Wonder Woman or something like
right,
that. It
right.
and that trope was replicated ad nauseum, and you still see it. And yes, that goes back to Wonder Woman, and yes, that was sort of an idea of that whole loving submission concept that was integral to the character. And what's funny about that is, the creator of Wonder Woman was inspired in part by seeing Emmeline Pankhurst speak after she was no platformed at Harvard. So
Right,
these things
right.
are not simple,
Yeah, yeah, no,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
Now,
so like getting back, because we're getting back to the term rape culture, because I
right.
say something about that. So yeah, so there is this whole concept that, basically, Western culture condones rape because it's misogynist. And it's really, if you look at like even like the cultural things that in popular culture and literature and film, it's really so much more complicated than that, and it's just such a huge oversimplification. A lot of the things that like I've looked at this feminist literature like from today about like, here are the things that prove that we have a rape culture, and it's if you look at
They're
the
a
alleged
partial hit.
facts and you
Yeah.
break them
Yeah.
down, it always turns out to be like incredibly more complicated. Like for instance, the like one example that I've seen given is, oh well, 31 states in America, in the United States, allow rapists to get custody of a child that is born from a rape. I've actually checked that out. It turns out that what that actually means is 31 states do not have laws that specifically prohibit
It's
a
not the same
rapist from
thing.
getting custody.
Yeah.
And if you listen to what the people say, like there are women, there are activists who are working on those issues, and they will even say, well, like actually the reason that these laws don't exist is not even really because anyone thinks that rapists should get custody. It's that, people just don't really think this even happens.
Hmm.
And I mean, I would be pretty sure that if an actual convicted rapist sued for custody, like when he came out of prison, like his chances of getting custody would be
Okay,
somewhere like
this
below
is a
0.1%.
this is a particular issue of mine that I struggle with, because on an emotional level, you don't want a rapist to win ever. Rape is seen as this fate worse than
Yeah,
death,
of course.
terrible, horrible, horrible, very bad thing, right? Double plus I'm good. But on the other hand, our criminal justice system has a rehabilitation
Mm,
component in it, where we're supposed to believe that prison is about rehabilitation,
that's
not
an interesting.
strictly punitive. So if somebody has done their time, this
Right,
idea of
right,
forgiveness and repentance, this so-called Judeo-Christian concept that our society is based on,
right, right.
this contradiction, I struggle with. I
Uh-huh.
don't
Yeah.
believe in punishing someone who is repentant
Hmm.
forever.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because I certainly think that, I mean, one of the other ironies of, modern feminism is that a lot of these like incredibly punitive and, harsh attitudes, uh, for which, conservatives typically get kind of lampooned when it comes to, law and order, a lot of these same attitudes kind of migrate very easily into feminism when it comes to sex crimes. Like, I've seen people um, on Tumblr,
Yeah.
admittedly, which
Oh God. Oh, we're
like
going
the
there. Okay, let's go.
repository of everything crazy about social justice.
Yeah.
I mean, I have seen people on Tumblr like write approvingly about, cultures in which rapists were castrated. And I'm thinking like, okay, well, first of all, do you actually know that in those cultures, like the only person who would be considered a rapist probably would be like somebody who raped a virgin, because it's really idiotic. But apart from that, it's like there was this tendency to kind of salivate over like the idea of incredibly sadistic punishments for rapists, and
There's an element of
it's
Rysandry to
yeah,
that. There
yeah,
really
but I mean,
is.
you raise an interesting point of like, would it always be wrong for, a rapist to get custody of, like, well, let's say that, for instance, the mother of the child is dead, and there is the surviving father who, at one point, raped the mother, served his time in prison, and is rehabilitated. And, is it better for that child to be in foster care or to be in the care of that father?
Well, it goes beyond that though, because
you could imagine a situation in which that would be a real, possibility.
well,
I
there's
think it would be very unlikely, but this idea that somehow, we allow, rapists to take away the children of the women that they've raped, that, this is not something that actually happens anywhere in real life. And other examples that I've seen of, I've seen, what's his name? Blurred Lines, Robin Thicke.
Mhm.
Oh, how can you say that we don't have a rape culture when, Blurred Lines was a #1 hit? I know where you stand on the whole Blurred Lines issue. I think that.
I think it was too much lyrical content, it coming from like a music programming background and
Right,
hip hop and the racist attitudes towards hip hop music.
right,
Lyrical content is something that is fiercely protected
right,
in
right.
non-pop forms of music, and I know you want it is not the same as you don't want it, I'm going to give it to you
Exactly.
anyway.
Yeah. And people actually pointed out you can find fairly similar lyrics in, Beyonce. You can find fairly similar lyrics in a number of female singers. I mean, you know, I know you want it. You want it. This is kind of really fairly standard kind of lyrical stuff. It's it. And there was this, I think it was BuzzFeed, somebody did this really idiotic piece where like they were comparing side by side like words from blurred lyrics from Blurred Lines and things that rape victims say their rapist said to them during the rape.
And that is a
And that was,
trigger. It is something people do say, but someone being triggered and something being
yeah,
inherently wrong are not the same
yeah,
thing.
but
I mean,
I'm sure you can probably find, you can find instances in which a rapist said I love you, you know
especially after the fact.
yeah, especially after the fact,
Yeah.
maybe like
Yeah.
immediately after the fact.
I mean, if you
Maybe
look
you could
at
probably find a lot of cases where a rapist said you're beautiful,
there's a lot of glorification of stalking in music videos as well.
yeah.
If you look at things like the video to Lionel Richie's Hello or
Oh, right,
something
right,
like Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, that's not a love song, but
right,
Hello, he's stalking a blind woman in that video. And
right,
and
right.
it as this is a difficult thing because as we've become a more gender equitable society, the whole idea of romance has gotten
Hmm.
disrupted. And this, when it goes back to any sort of culture, this is putting on the anthropology hat for a minute.
Right,
There's culture and there's a cultural taboo. You
right.
cannot claim that we live in a rape culture and say that rape is a taboo at the same time. Because
Yeah,
if we
yeah,
live in a culture that permits rape, then rape by definition is not a taboo.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and there are some really freak me out studies coming out that, especially in the whole campus rape thing,
Right,
a lot of guys who are single time offenders,
right,
meaning they're not serial, they did it
right,
once and they learned and they never did it again,
right,
didn't know what they were doing was actually sexual assault.
right, right.
And that blows my mind. Now, that says a couple things to me. One, this all men are rapists thing, which is a
Mhm.
contributor to rape
Right,
culture, I
right,
believe, which comes from feminism.
right,
Um, if you believe in rape culture, I'm using it as shorthand.
right.
But we clearly have an education problem with young men that I think we need to service. We need to serve that need because it's getting guys into trouble who don't. They're
Mhm.
doing what they think they're supposed to do, and it's getting them into trouble. That's
Right,
not fair to these young men that don't intend
right,
to be terrible.
right,
The worst people in the world.
right,
Rape
right,
is that
right.
subsection of misogyny, which
Yeah,
are
yeah,
worst person in the world territory.
right,
So if that's true, then that's something we can do something about.
right,
But then
right,
at the same time, I see in literature them using this idea of rape being the worst thing in the world, a fate worse than
Oh yeah,
death.
yeah. No, that's yeah,
And
yeah.
so we have these two
Well,
extremes.
yeah, but it's also like we're still kind of grappling with the definition of rape, and when does I mean, I've seen people say that basically like all unwanted sex is rape, even if you didn't really do anything to indicate that that it is unwanted, and even if you kind of pretend to go along with it. And I mean, do we hold women to the same standards? I mean, are you like, if you
Yeah,
sort
that's
of
harder.
coaxed an initially reluctant person into having sex, if you're a woman, or you're a rapist? What, and to me, I mean, I think that one of the things that really bothers me, and it's something I've written about, again, since the 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
there is a tendency, I think, to kind of conflate the need for a discussion of like better sexual ethics, with a conversation about rape and consent. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I absolutely think that pressuring someone into having sex with you when they're not sure that they're ready for it is, I mean, I think it's bad. I mean, I think it's ethically wrong. Is it rape? I don't think so. I mean,
Okay, but
I really
let's
think that,
face it.
yeah,
Let's face it. There's so much shame and guilt connected to female consent that there is almost a cultural expectation that a woman has to be controlled. She can't give in too easily because then she's a slut. It's a
yeah,
catch
I
22. You
think
can't win.
yeah. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
it's true to the same extent as it was in the 50s, but I think
No, but
there's still a lot of, I mean,
calling a
in
woman a
many circles,
slut still
there's
has
still
career
things going
ramifications.
on. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think, I mean, is it, by the way, is it always wrong to persuade someone to have sex with you who initially wasn't sure that they wanted to? I don't think it. I mean, there's a difference between pressure and persuasion. I mean,
Well,
I mean,
persuasion and coercion as
right,
well,
exactly.
completely
Yeah,
different
yeah, yeah,
things.
right. Of
Yeah.
course. I mean, like I know a gay couple that initially met when one of them was I mean, she sort of knew that she was gay, but she was religious, and she had been raised to believe that it was a sin. And like when their relationship began as a friendship,
Mm-hmm.
it began as an online friendship. And when one of them, the one who was a Christian, when they went to meet for the first time, she actually said, in an online conversation, we're not going to have sex. I'm just, we're just going to hang out together. And,
Famous
please
last words.
remember that
Yeah.
I'm opposed to, I'm not okay with, with same sex, sexuality. And then, one thing led to another, and they did end up in bed. So, I mean,
Which is the plot of an episode of
yeah,
Supergirl.
yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
But,
it's I'm not
I
gay, sucking face by the end of the episode.
right,
Yeah.
right. But, I mean, I literally know, I mean, I've spoken to feminists who will tell you that, like, at least if we're talking about a heterosexual couple, if the woman said, like, at the start of the date, we're not going to have sex, and then they end up having sex, that's
Mm-hmm.
rape. Now I don't know if they would still apply that if she's the one who initiated it, which is also possible.
There's so
But
many conflicted messages
yeah,
on
and
this.
like, there are so many. I mean, sex is just this hugely complicated, messy, and I don't really mean, messy in the literal physical
But
sense,
that is
although
also
that
true.
just,
It is kind of a
yeah,
messy activity.
yeah, yeah.
Cleanup is required after the
Right, right,
fact. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, emotionally, people send mixed signals. People change their minds, sometimes very quickly. People do something that they later regret for all sorts of reasons, and not just women. Um, I mean,
Especially in the age of hookup culture where there's
and I
very
think
little time.
uh, it's again, getting into like the whole issue of gender norms. I don't think it's like permissible for a guy uh like a lot of guys have, don't feel that great about a hookup they had. A guy doesn't have the same social sanction to say, oh, well, actually, I didn't want it. I was forced into it. People
Because
will
they
have,
don't have to
yeah,
defend putting out, right?
right,
The
right,
way we frame the whole
right,
encounter that
right.
sex is something men take from women
Yeah,
in a
yeah. No,
heteronormative paradigm,
exactly. And I think,
that inherently is the problem with
yes, of
all
course.
of this stuff.
Yes, of course. And I mean, the problem to me is that, you know, the very same feminists who ostensibly are criticizing that mentality are actually perpetuating it. Like when you're saying that, if these two kids in college did something sexual and there was no like explicit consent, there is a very growing kind of very common tendency these days to say, well, that means, she was raped. Why are you saying that she was raped? Why is it not equally likely that he was raped? What about situations in which they're both drunk? And I mean, I've seen,
And that's a huge thing, that it's a do not pass go when you start talking about
yeah,
alcohol and
yeah,
hookups.
yeah. And I mean, I've actually seen, like, there was a case in which, you've probably heard, I don't know if this is going on in Canada, but in the United States, there's been a kind of, growing number of male students who are suing colleges and universities for expelling them over, what they say was a consensual sex episode. Very, very often when, one or usually both people were under the influence. And in one of those cases, at I believe the University of North Carolina, they called the dean of students, who was responsible for initiating the case, to testify. And they were asking her about how they apply the consent policies.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually explicitly said that when you have a male and a female, both of whom were intoxicated, uh, having sex, the male is going to be the one who's held responsible because, it's kind of assumed that, it's the female that has to give consent. And it's all very much based in this mentality that, sex is something that the guy takes from the girl.
I think there's
So,
something more to it, though, that in that instance, the guy isn't going to wake up sore the next day. There is actually a physical injury component to it. That knowing people who went through exactly that, like I know some women who got drunk, really drunk at a party, and
uh-huh.
woke up walking funny the next day, and they don't
Yeah,
remember
right,
any of
right.
it. That is a really dislocated
Mm.
place to be. But do we treat this as a criminal justice issue, or do we
Well,
treat this
yeah,
as a public health issue?
that's exactly it. And that's what,
Right.
I mean, I have one of my problems with, treating, and, I can understand saying that, we have all these kids in college, who, many of whom led a very sheltered life prior to college, and who find themselves in this new environment among all these people, at these alcohol drenched parties. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I've been there, a lot of us have been there, and, you know, I think it is entirely legitimate to say that, a college should have the ability to kind of steer those people in a direction where, they're going to have, healthier relationships, where they're not going to have something traumatizing happen to them, where, they're not going to be, depressed and devastated because of a bad experience. Uh, I think that's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
My problem is that once you kind of put that in the framework of rape, you've really automatically decided that you're going to have one person, usually male, who is entirely responsible for everything, who is completely, the only one you're going to hold accountable. And you're going to have another person, usually the female, who is placed in the victim role. And in that case, to ask her to in any way question or examine her own behavior is going to be victim blaming, so
You're also putting a scar or a tattoo, I prefer to say, on somebody's identity.
basically,
It
yeah,
isn't the same big
yeah,
H on the forehead, to use a Red Dwarf reference,
Uh-huh.
when, somebody is a rape survivor. That is a big threshold to
Yeah,
cross.
or
And
a
I
perpetrator,
I I think it, on the survivor side, I think it prevents some people from identifying that way, and it
Oh,
actually
absolutely.
prevents them from processing it, or
Yeah,
healing, if
yeah,
people want to say
absolutely.
it. It's a real, and I think people are hesitant to talk about their experience because rape survivor is such a heavy thing,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
you
Yeah, and
know.
I mean, I've looked at some of these cases. I mean, I've interviewed some people who were involved in those cases, and I've looked over like the records from these cases. And in many in many of those instances, you really do have people behaving in a kind of messed up way. You have a lot of like cross signals. You have one person kind of coming into this with very different expectations than the other, and you have people kind of being hurt emotionally. And I think that in many of those cases, the situation could have been resolved with counseling.
Mhm.
With the situation could have been resolved. There was one of these cases that I wrote about, in which, I mean, it was kind of a huge mess where the guy got suspended after being found responsible for, sexual misconduct, not sexual assault per se. When he came back after his suspension, the woman went public, and, there was a huge, protest on campus with, oh, this rapist is coming back to class, and she's going to have to, be on the same campus as her rapist,
Mhm.
even though the word rape was certainly never in the
In
charges that he was found responsible on, and he ended up just quitting the university
See, I
because
think
yeah,
there's a deeper campus issue
and
there.
right, but what I was
Yeah.
going to say is, so um, I looked at a lot of the records from that case. I interviewed the guy. I read like interviews with the girl that were done from, that were done by the same publication that I wrote this for. This was for the
Mhm.
Daily Beast. Uh, and it was really pretty clear that, they had had an on and off relationship, which was really pretty much over.
Mhm.
They were both, they met at a party. They went back to the guy's place, and like assuming that, as he says, all of the sex was consensual, it is still pretty clear from his own account that he basically acted like a jerk. Right?
Yeah, and it's funny to me
But and
because
he
that.
actually even admitted it. But she was very depressed. Afterwards, she had a lot of other issues. Uh, when the guy got called into the office for Title IX enforcement with regard
Right.
to sexual misconduct, uh, the guy's father told me that he went to speak to the dean, and he said, I think that I do think that my son kind of messed up. I think that the girl obviously feels genuinely hurt. It would be really great to kind of sit them both down together and like have them talk it out. And then the dean said, oh, no, 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 like we cannot possibly do that because this is a potential sexual assault case. And, you don't sit a victim and a, perpetrator in the same room and, have them talk out their differences. And that I think is, I mean, if you were talking about a violent rape, absolutely that would be the right approach. When you're talking about something that is arguably a miscommunication,
Mhm.
and a lot of cross signals on both sides, I think that would probably be very good in many of these cases, and it's precluded by the use of the rape label.
See, I think that this is getting into something that I see as something that is kind of a cultural social thing, and it's this cultural collectivism that we're seeing at the academic level, the Google workplace where everything's open workspaces, nobody has an office, nobody even
Right.
has a cubicle anymore. It's harder to get away
Yeah.
from jerks, right? And I
Right.
think people are feeling pressure to escalate conflicts to something that someone will do something about. And I think there's a huge gulf between nothing happened and we can act on this.
Yeah.
In schools, in workplaces now, most people just don't want to get involved because they don't want to get sued. And in a lot of these cases, there's nothing happened, and then there's crime was committed. And that
Uh,
massive space between the two of them, between that 8% and that 14 to 3%, depending on what statistic you
yeah.
believe,
Yeah.
right? There's a huge gulf. And that's where the school should actually being involved. And
Yeah.
like, okay, you two don't like each other. We see value to both of you. We're going to find a way where you two can both attend
Right.
school, but aren't shoved in each other's face. The
Yeah.
school won't
Yeah.
do that. It's, well, you have to learn to work with people you don't like.
Oh
That's
yeah. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
not you could not put me and Milo in a room together. Do
No.
I hate the guy? No, but that's a bad idea. The whole
Yeah.
thing would
Yeah.
just descend into this name calling mess. It's not
Absolutely.
productive. And instead of it being, well, you two can attend the same conferences, but God, just stay away from each other,
Mhm.
it's, well, we have to invite one or the other. To just use one example, people have to invite me or Anita Sarkeesian. People have to invite
Mm.
me or Catherine Cross, and that's silly. The
Yeah.
whole idea is to get a collection of different, sometimes radically different opinions, because nobody is right about
Yeah.
everything, but that doesn't mean that
Oh yeah.
somebody,
Yeah. Yeah.
innovation is being wrong 9 times and right the 10th.
Yeah. Definitely.
Right? And
Definitely.
we
Yeah.
seem to be focused on this culture of this, if you're wrong once, you're wrong. It's that punitive thing I was talking about again.
Yeah. Yeah.
You never pay for your crime.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it just seems to me that the fundamental aspects of, this Christian culture that people war over, the good parts of the Judeo-Christian ethic that, let's face it, innocent until proven guilty,
Oh
paying
yeah.
for
Yeah.
your crime, the
Yeah.
real thing of an eye for an eye, which means proportional
Yeah.
response.
Right.
All these things seem to be lost both on, what you want to call atheism plus
Oh God.
and on the alt-right, which, I don't
Yeah.
know, to me
Yeah.
both look kind of like the same thing. And it seems like
Yeah.
a lot of people have jumped from one to the other.
Hmm.
And
Probably. Yeah.
there's a real, because I grew up in a very multicultural background, I know that people coming over from Eastern Europe, whenever people tried to say, no, religion shouldn't be practiced at all, they had a very strong response because they lived under
Hmm.
communism. Whenever
Oh.
somebody tried to shut down any sort of discourse based on moral policing, they had a very strong response
Yeah. Yes.
because they grew up under
Uh-huh.
communism.
Yeah.
But that seems to be all that's happening right now, that people just
Mm.
shame people into silence, and we can't actually have a conversation because we seem to be fighting over who was most wrong.
Yes, that is very true. That is very.
And I part of the reason I'm talking to a large group of people and doing these long form interviews is a lot of similarity with what Dave Rubin's doing over on his channel. Is I just want to have the conversations because I learn from them and people learn from them.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I think we need to do more of this.
But
Yeah.
somebody like yourself that has a very moderate viewpoint from what I've read of your writing. There's a difference between having a moderate viewpoint but saying it forcefully, which is what you
Yes.
do,
Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
having an
A lot of
extreme
people
viewpoint.
assume that if you have a moderate viewpoint, you're kind of a weenie, like you're
Yeah.
just, Yeah. No. No. Definitely not. I mean, I have very strong opinions. I mean,
But
I
politically you're
very
quite
often,
moderate.
yeah. I very often, by the way, get kind of teased about, doing too much of the sort of on the one hand, on the other hand thing. But, I really do try to look for, for nuance and issues. And I mean, I always kind of find it amusing when people criticize me for that, because, like, yeah, like, how dare you look at different sides of the issue?
But that to me is the strength in your writing. But then you see the ridiculousness that happened in Ottawa with people protesting your talk, which I,
Oh God,
I don't
yeah.
even know what their issue was.
Oh,
And
I think
this,
I'm a rape apologist. That I think that was their
oh,
issue.
is that
I'm
what
a
it
rape.
was?
Yes, yes, that was literally their issue. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because, I
yeah.
mean, I don't get that at all based on this conversation we just
Right.
had.
No.
You don't
Yeah.
see, people hear that and people believe that, and people just go, oh, I don't want to be associated with a rape apologist, or in my
Yeah.
case,
Yeah.
I don't want to be associated with a transphobe.
Right.
And
Right.
people just repeat rape apologist, transphobe, transphobe. They never
Yeah.
actually see what you really do believe. And in your
Yeah.
case,
Yeah. That's the whole thing. That's
you
the whole thing.
don't you don't seem you seem like the exact opposite of a rape apologist to me. You seem like, let's
Well,
really
thank you.
understand this issue so that the
Right.
people, everybody who needs help should get help. We just have to find the right help. That's how I summarize your position,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
you
Yeah, but
know?
I mean, I think I think the origin of the label. I mean, I don't accept some of the really expansive definitions of rape. I don't subscribe to the view that, oh, well, if someone says they were raped, then we absolutely have to believe that they were raped.
Well,
No
that's treating
matter
it like a different
what.
kind of crime than other crimes. And if it's a
Yeah,
crime of
exactly.
violence, it should be
Exactly.
treated
So yeah,
like all other
no,
crimes
and
of
I do
violence.
think that's very ironic that, in many ways, feminists started out saying that, rape should be treated the same as other crimes. And now we're seeing this push for treating it completely differently. I mean, Julie Bindel in England has written that we shouldn't have jury trials for rape. I don't know if you saw that.
See,
Uh,
I agree with that, but for a different reason.
oh, okay.
Because I think that a judge, the Jian Ghomeshi trial is a
Oh, yeah.
shining example. That was a trial by judge.
Ah,
If
okay.
it had been a trial by jury, it's a roll of the dice. He could have been
Oh,
convicted.
right,
A
right. That's
judge
yeah. So you're
weighs the
coming at it from
evidence
a
and
completely
interprets.
different
But this is
different
this is
viewpoint than yeah. But Julie Bindel thinks that juries are too prejudiced against women,
oh,
and
that's ridiculous. It
yeah, of
depends on
course,
the jury.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean,
And
here's the
what's
thing.
really funny to me, by the way, is that Julie Bindel got no platformed over something that she wrote about transgender issues that was
Yeah.
NPC. And I'm thinking, well, that's really funny, because apparently, you can call for the selective abolition of the jury system for one crime only, and that's fine. But if you write something that doesn't, entirely conform to the ideology du jour on transgender issues, then we're gonna, make sure,
Well, I mean,
you know.
trans exclusive radical feminism is a serious
Oh yeah, yeah,
problem. And it's
yeah,
possible she is, but I mean, like, what a silly argument to have. I understand a
yeah.
think piece about the benefits of trial by judge over trial by jury
Sure, yeah,
in
yeah.
rape cases. I just made an argument for it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But
but actually, it would be really interesting to, like, I would love to see Julie Bindel's reaction to your argument. I think it would
just,
probably,
yeah,
you know,
Julie, I'm giving you what you want, but you're not gonna like the reason why. But
right.
I think that,
That's,
and this goes back to rights of the accused, right? It's up to the
oh yeah,
accused
yeah, of
to
course.
decide whether they want to be judged by their peers or judged by their judge. They roll the dice, they take their chances. The whole
Yeah,
point of having flexibility in the
yeah,
in the criminal justice system is precisely so that the accused feels like they got the best shot.
right, right.
Now, in most cases, something like a rape trial, a good defense attorney is going to
Right.
be no trial by judge,
Yeah,
please,
yeah.
especially if
That's
especially
probably,
if
yeah.
the accused is black in a white county, you want a trial by judge, not a trial by
Oh yeah, yeah,
jury,
yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
the feelings that are engendered in the jury when they're hearing these graphic descriptions, when these
Oh
women
yeah, yeah,
are talking
absolutely.
about their suffering. All you need is a hung jury, and the accused has
Hmm.
to go through it all over again.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well,
I
but I
mean,
think there really is this notion that, it, it's it's progressive to be for the rights of the accused in every single type of crime,
mhm.
except when it comes to rape or sexual assault, in which case it makes you a rape apologist,
but
which is
but
why
this
I'm a
is
rape apologist,
this is the
And,
Dwork side
yeah,
again, what I call the
yeah,
Dwork side, that Catherine
right,
McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin got
right.
so fixated on a deeply personalized story of
Oh yeah,
unpunished sexual assault, right? That
right.
it did become more personal, and it's made this thing that the assumption in society of a woman who is raped, and they do use the word rape, not sexually
Oh, of
assaulted,
course,
which
yeah.
has a strata, but a woman who is raped is destroyed, ruined, broken forever. It's something
Oh,
you
of
can never
course.
get over.
Yeah, yeah,
And this is something I have a real issue with. It makes a woman choose whether to be seen under that lens, to be seen as broken, to be seen as damaged, or to hide what happened to her.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good point. That's
And
that.
I
Yeah.
don't think that when I think it's changing for men, there's a huge amount of stigma for
Mhm.
men who come forward,
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
but a straight man who comes forward and says, I was abused by a priest, or,
Right.
the press does not treat them as forever broken. So, oh, let us care for you now. Your life is done.
Really, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And I have a real issue with, because to me, the whole purpose of justice, the whole
Right.
concept of justice, which is why I don't like separating criminal justice from social justice,
Mm.
is that the victims and their families have an ability to move on and
Yeah.
close the door on that pain. It's
Oh,
not
yeah.
that you
Yeah.
forget
Yeah.
that you have a child that was murdered, it's that these crimes uproot a family's sense of fairness in
Mm.
the world. And the
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
idea of justice is to reassert that sense that the
Yeah.
world is essentially fair with notable exceptions.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's reasserting trust in systems. And I think we're living in a time right now where people don't trust the systems. And so they're
Oh,
trying to force
absolutely.
the systems to be what they would like them to be,
Yeah. Yeah.
instead of
Yeah, and we're
recognizing,
seeing that again from both the left and the right.
yeah,
We're seeing the feminists who say, we will not accept this acquittal because, if you're accused of rape, you're guilty. And if you got acquitted,
yeah,
that's evidence that, rape culture doesn't work. So we're seeing that at one end, and we're seeing the far right, at the other end, with the kind of the anti-establishment rebellion. So yeah, it certainly is an interesting time.
yeah. I mean, this has all happened before, this will all happen again. I think society will eventually come out of this pendulum swing in out of
I hope so.
authoritarianism. Well, it happens, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
this feels a lot like there's it's funny because there's slices of past generations.
Yeah.
We're living in an age of all sort of the tribal polarism of the
Yeah.
terror of the French Revolution without a physical
That's
guillotine. People are being beheaded in terms of professional reputation in
yeah,
instant,
yeah.
we're live, and it's funny because anonymous pamphlet writing was a huge
Oh,
part of the
absolutely.
lead up.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
I thought
so
that analogy.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny, and of course, prolonged war,
Yeah.
the social scarring that happens when there's a long time war with no end in sight. I mean, that's an element of the French Revolution that people don't really understand. That
Yeah, yeah, that's
they were being sent out to fight these wars. They had no say in them. The king just decided, go out and die for what
yeah.
was really the economic prosperity of the kingdom at the time, but they were like, we have no say in this. And you're seeing a lot of that in England right now, a lot
Mhm.
of that in America, but
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the context for this is something that I've had people who know kind of that part of history go, yeah, people who
Mm,
don't just dismiss it out of hand. They refuse to accept the new
mm.
input, and there seems to be, people call it a religion, but I
I think it does have I mean, I think a lot of revolutions have a religious element, I think a
see,
lot of,
I go one further. I'm going to invoke Marx and saying it is an opiate the way religion was an opiate. It's not a religion because there isn't a moral framework, but it is certainly
well, there
an opiate.
kind of is. I mean, the social justice ideology is extremely moralistic in
Is
some
it
ways.
though?
It's just a different kind of morality, though.
It's a behavior control, but if you ask what the moral framework surrounding those behavior controls are, they'll
Hmm,
say, oh, individual freedom. There's a complete disconnect.
I don't. Well, that's an interest. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
I need to process
They're
this.
the unifying box, the
Mm,
boundary.
I don't know though, because I think in many ways I think they're less about freedom than I mean I think they're sort of the moral pinnacle to them is equality, not which is often in tension with freedom. And if I mean I think that there is a kind of religious utopian element to
See,
like the social
religion,
justice ideology, which is I mean
but
it's religious.
religion requires hierarchy, which they don't have. It's collectivist. It's whatever the mass, whatever the horde
Yeah, but
says.
there have been religious cults that were very anti-hierarchical.
But
So I know. I mean,
who's the leader of the social justice cult?
that's a good point. Yeah, it doesn't have a
There's a
leader. Yeah, it doesn't have a
and
leader, but I mean, I think it does have the kind of the element. I mean, some people have compared it to revivalism in 19th century America, which also didn't have a leader. It had a
it
lot of
had local
individual
leaders though.
it had a lot of preachers
Yeah.
who were sort of like yeah, but I mean the social justice movement has these figures that it kind of coalesces around, Anita
But they're
Sarkeesian.
spokespeople more than leaders.
Hmm.
You could say Bell Hooks is a leader in the sense that she calls Beyonce a terrorist, and people go, can I accept that Beyonce's a terrorist? Can I actually make this work? I mean, they struggle to agree with her. Anita
Right,
Sarkeesian is a spokesperson in that
right,
she isn't saying anything new. She's echoing
right,
Hooks.
right,
She's echoing, oh, I forget the feminist who quote
right,
fighting
right.
fucked all. She's a spokesperson. She's the Sean Spicer of sex negative feminism
Oh,
right now. Like
yeah.
she's not coming up with anything new. Bell Hooks, for all the times I
Oh yeah,
disagree
yeah.
with
No,
her,
I agree with that.
at least she's still thinking, right? Like
Yeah,
at
yeah,
least
yeah,
she's still working it. And
yeah.
there's a classic example of she did some really important stuff. She talked about for lack of a better term, the benefits to black men of the male gaze, where they could go into white cinema and look at a white woman without
Mhm.
having rocks thrown at them or being
Oh,
lynched.
yeah, yeah,
This These are things where you can find her a thoroughly unpleasant
right,
personality, and she
right,
does. She says things to shock. She's a Harley Quinn's mallet. I keep going back to Harley Quinn.
right.
Moral of this thing, Harley Quinn. But she does. She hits you like a hammer. But there are real gems in all that whack-a-mole,
Sure.
you know? And she's a classic example of, are we better off in terms of thought, in intellectualism, for lack of a better term? Are we better off as a society because we allowed her to say all these stupid, ridiculous things for that dozen things or so that were really, really brilliant?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I'm always on the side of more speech, but getting back to like the religious element. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's again, it boils down to the definition of religion. I mean, I think it does have a very like the social justice movement has a very kind of intense moralistic component in that it treats moral transgressions very harshly. It kind of fetishizes a particular ideal, which is basically that people should never be treated differently from each other based on any sort of like protected characteristic,
But
like
that's
any
the
sort of,
Marxism, which is deliberately a-religious.
yeah,
And
but
that's the issue. This is what
yeah,
makes it
like
so
yeah, I
confusing.
guess this is where you get into definitions, because certainly at various points Marxism has been treated as a religion as well.
And that's the
I think
irony of
anything
it.
can become a religion in that it gives people a perceived kind of higher purpose. It
Yeah.
connects them to a greater whole. It allows them to kind of transcend their own individual concerns and kind of subsumes them into, again, something greater. It sets up this absolute standard of right and wrong. So I think that there is. I mean, it all depends really on what you consider to be religion.
Well,
So I mean,
the
I definitely
big
kind of
question is
religion.
that, in democracies we have
It's
separation of
religion
church and
without
state.
consent.
Yeah. I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
in democracies we have this idea of separation of church and state that gets violated all the time, let's face it, but we have it on the books as an
sure.
idea. In Marxism, the state replaces religion. And this is
Mm.
what I think is happening in the social justice
Ah,
movement. The
I see what
lack
you mean.
of a higher framework, the lack of
Ah,
any God before the God of social justice
right, right.
creates the Pharaoh that knew not Joseph, and they have lost that entire history of
Mm.
thought. They are stuck in an ideology that
Yeah.
appeared with Dworkin that is
Mm.
all just a raw wound that isn't being challenged, because the whole
Yeah.
purpose of religion is, to me, I mean, what I benefit from it is, hey, there's something to kick your ass and keep you on the right path when everyone around you is saying you're wrong.
Mm.
That doesn't
Right, right.
happen in
Yeah.
the social justice movement. When everyone around you is saying you're wrong, that means you're wrong. Period. End of
Oh
story.
yeah,
There is
yeah.
no higher court.
Right, right.
And this is my issue with it, that is not justice. That is a
Mm.
mob.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
And,
That's a good.
if religion is morality and morality is justice, the social justice movement is having real problems, because the minute someone says
Yeah.
something that violates a taboo, they kick them out. That's not
Oh yeah, yeah,
justice.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
And I mean, you see it on the right too. I mean, Milo proves the right's no better.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right? They'd rather kick him out than rehabilitate him. Nobody kind of came to him like, look, kid, here's what you got to do now. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
Mm.
he's got his own personal Kellyanne
Who
Conway who's
knows?
helping him
Yeah.
through this.
We'll
I
see what
hope so.
happens tomorrow.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and we're kind of coming full circle here, but I'd like to see
Yeah.
more of that. I mean, Chris Brown got rehabilitated, but he
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
He got his image rehabilitated. He got his career rehabilitated. And where
Mm.
are we? Another woman accused him of beating her up.
Right, right.
And
Yeah.
is that because he actually hasn't learned? Or is that because now he's an easy target? It's
That's a good point.
really hard to say. Is he getting Michael Jackson, that once you settle with one kid,
Yeah, that's very true. That's very
and these issues are not simple, and that's why, this was supposed to be the whole idea between separation of criminal justice and social justice that I understood, because I always like, why does it have to be social justice? Why can't it be just justice? Social justice sounds dumb.
right.
And, well,
Right.
because it's separate from criminal justice, because criminal justice isn't truly just. It's racist, it's sexist, it's all that. But now you see the social justice crusaders wanting to tell the criminal justice system how to mind its business.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Doesn't that, like, what am I missing? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of separation of criminal justice and social justice? Like, I thought social justice was all about moving society forward through grassroots activism and not government and the courts.
Yeah, no, I think it's abandoned that principle a while back.
Yeah.
So,
Okay,
and actually, I mean, I do think that if you look at social justice as having this religious component, which I still think it does, I mean, I think it does kind of raise interesting issues about, if you're going to insist on separation of church and state, what about these kind of quasi-religious ideologies when they start influencing the state. I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting is that, and I don't know what the situation is in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
but in the United States, for instance, right now, and for some years, domestic violence programs, in order to qualify for federal funding under the Violence Against Women Act, have to get approval from the National Coalition
Yes.
Against Domestic Violence, which is very much into this sort of intersectional ideology. They're very much into this, idea that, all domestic violence is related to, the patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
They're very much against, for instance, joint counseling for couples in which, there has been abuse. They're very, very kind of suspicious about recognizing women as abusers. They really don't like the idea. Like, they really tend toward the approach that, violent women are just victims of abuse who are fighting back.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have this,
Ideological gatekeeping.
so yeah, you have this ideological gatekeeping. And I mean, I've heard people say that this is actually, this is very bad. This is resulting in, good programs losing funding because they don't conform to these ideological strictures. You have, women who have problems with violence, their own violence, have a really hard time getting the counseling they need, ironically, because
Yeah.
the, officially approved counseling doesn't recognize the existence of violent women.
Well,
And
up here, the problem is you don't get
so,
your
yes,
counseling subsidized unless a
I
charge
don't
is
wanna,
laid.
yeah, so I don't want to get hung up on labels. So,
Yeah.
I don't want to get into an argument of, does this violate the separation of church and state? But, because it's
It's a
pretty
good point.
obvious to me that, for instance, if somebody tried to pass a law that, a domestic violence program can only get funding if it recognizes, the existence of God, or if it
Yeah.
recognizes that, domestic violence stems from, from lack of religious values, it's very obvious to anyone that this would never fly. This would be considered completely unacceptable. And
Isn't
yeah,
this a symptom of a larger problem, though? I mean, this is the war on drugs all over again.
oh yeah, that's very true. That's very,
It's the
yeah,
war on illegal immigration. It's making the same mistakes. It
right,
is
right,
following an ideology that should work, even though
right,
all the facts show
right.
it doesn't work. And I mean, drug abuse goes down when drug abuse is treated like a public health issue,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
a crime and punishment issue. That they
Mm,
threw the book at drug offenders and it just filled up the prisons and
yeah, yeah,
disproportionately
yeah,
black men.
right.
Whereas immigration's the same way. You're gonna build these horrible ugly walls and that are fences, but they're walls, but they're fences, and you're gonna spend all this money.
Right.
And considering the problem is visa overstays, well, you're really
Yeah,
only
yeah,
solving, maybe to be generous,
yeah,
40%.
yeah. No, very
So the visa overstay quotient is just going to become a bigger
true. Mhm.
portion of the problem. And I think that this whole sexual assault, and let's face it, the numbers are really alarming. The sheer number of people who are reporting having this happen to them
Mhm.
is awful, but only a small portion of those are ever going to actually get justice,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Where, because it's innocent until proven guilty, that is the criminal burden that should not be changed.
right,
we
right.
we almost need the equivalent of, well, what happened after OJ Simpson got off? Well,
Oh,
the Brown family
yeah,
just sued the shit out of him,
yeah.
right?
And then he ended up going to prison on a completely unrelated thing
But
because,
even
yeah,
even before that, the
right, right.
financial judgment against him
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
was so severe because that's preponderance of
yeah,
evidence,
yeah,
not, and there's all this financial crimes and everything like that. The idea is it better for this person to continue working so they can pay restitution to the victims? Is throwing them in prison the right thing to do?
yeah,
And
yeah.
this is a conversation because of the emotions surrounding it, because of the way we've built up
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault as a crime against women, and therefore all this
Right,
other,
right.
is it sex, is it violence, is it blah 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 blah
Oh,
blah.
yeah, yeah,
We can't have this conversation because emotions are running too high.
yeah.
And
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And, I mean, we should probably be bringing this to a conclusion because we've
yeah,
been
yeah,
going
yeah,
for some
yeah.
time. But,
We've been
since we
trying.
have talked about, rape culture quite a bit, I just want to reiterate once again that I think, we really need to have a conversation that, um, more clearly separates, sexual assault from, um, unwanted sex that isn't really an assault. I mean, and I think this is really something that we kind of need to get back to because I think we've kind of gotten away from this in recent years, and we've kind of I think we've gone way too far in defining all sorts of bad, again, admittedly bad and, unpleasant situations as sexual assault. And here's, I think, the mistake that is being made is that there's an assumption that if you don't define it as sexual assault, then, there's nothing wrong with it. I
This
think
is what I
that's,
was talking about
yeah,
earlier, that
yeah,
massive gulf,
exactly. Yeah. So
right?
that's the notion. That's the idea that, you can't really talk about it as a problem, as hurtful, as damaging, unless you classify it as sexual assault. And
As
I think
criminal.
that is the real issue. And I mean, I think that there's, because, once you put it in that category, uh, once you've classified it as sexual assault, then either you go through the justice system or, as we're doing now, you try to, ruin someone's career and basically make them a social pariah and make them unemployable
Mm-hmm.
because they're a rapist. And, it's kind of interesting, like looking at some of the really high profile cases, like James Dean, who
Yeah.
sort of made a comeback, like at one point it kind of looked like he was never going to work again, but apparently a lot of women in the industry still support him, and, he's sort of back, and that was another case, by the way, that I wrote about that I think is really much, much more complicated than was recognized at the time.
I'm personally really uncomfortable with trying those things in the press just because, not.
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't been accused of rape, but I've been accused of other things. And the
Right, right.
problem is, in the court of public opinion, there's no rights of the accused.
Oh, yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah,
And
yeah.
now, to bring this in for a landing, because, and maybe this is the discussion for a roundtable at a later
Yeah,
time. I'm already starting to think about that
yeah,
this might be actually very productive. But what do we do about this gap we've identified between nothing happened and criminal behavior? How
yeah,
do we say, how do we enforce this was bad but not criminal, and have that have any meaning whatsoever? Because playing devil's advocate here, when you take someone like one of these gadflies who say things
right.
that hurt people quite badly emotionally, but also influence public policy
Hmm.
in a very real way, they create the talking points that legislators then
Yeah.
echo. How do we put that in its right place? How do we go, this isn't criminal, but this is wrong, and this means we need to do something, not do nothing? And how do we
Well,
find out what that
how
something
do we
is?
go about it? I think we try to change the conversation. That's what I've tried to do. I mean, I think that, for instance, again, like if we're talking about things that happen in college, on college campuses, I mean, I would be very much in favor of setting up a system of, counseling, or maybe peer-to-peer counseling, maybe, counseling involving, deans and whatnot, that would deal with some of those cases, that would, help people work things through without labeling them as sexual assault, because that is the only way right now that anything gets done.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really perverse incentive that, it's an incentive to people to, again, anything bad that happens to you in a sexual setting, anything that you regret, anything that you feel bad about, you're not really going to get any attention for it unless you label it sexual assault. And, and that's really, that's just bad in all sorts of ways. So,
Well, I think people don't.
we try to change the conversation. Right now, it's just such a strange cultural moment. There are just so many things going on, both on the left and on the right. So, I think right now it's, at least in the United States, we have this incredibly weird situation where I think, essentially Trump is kind of sucking up all the air.
I can't even keep your system straight now. The Republicans
Yeah.
are protectionists, the Democrats are the
Nothing else
globalists.
going on. It's like we're all watching Trump's Twitter feed, 24 hours a day and, discussing the latest crazy thing he said. And, and it's kind of ironic because, for instance, like some people, I know people who work with, organizations that are pushing for a kind of saner policy on campus sexual assault. And, some of them are people who are parents of accused, kids. So they do have a personal stake in this. I don't think any of them are, supporters of rape culture. And some of them, I think, have had kind of hopes that, a Trump administration, because it is kind of, the opposite of the kind of the politically correct establishment.
Yeah.
They would, bring about some kind of change in this area. That maybe like the current rules on campus sexual assault would get reconsidered because there are federal policies that really encourage and institutionalize the current approach. I would be all for reforming that. I don't really expect anything sane from this administration because it's going to be constantly tied up in scandals and, bizarre stuff. And because, anything that they do is going to be suspect for a lot of people in the center just because it's associated with all this craziness. So, I don't really know where we're going from here. Everything is.
Well, do you think that this administration could just accidentally cause everybody else to act like grown-ups? Because mom and dad are fighting, the kids need to deal with their own stuff.
That would be great. And I do think that maybe, possibly, I think some people on the left kind of are looking at their own responsibility for creating the cultural mess that we're in now. So, maybe that's a good thing. I do think that Trump in many ways is more a symptom of a crisis, of a cultural crisis than its cause, and I think maybe, the situation that we're in now actually will give people an incentive to, again, kind of look at the causes of this crisis and kind of look at what can be done to restore a more, a kind of saner public conversation. I hope so. I certainly hope so. So let's just end on this really hopeful and optimistic.
Yay, that's what I like. That's what I like. I try to find a place to come in where everybody can feel happy. Yeah.
Yeah, and at some point I would love to do a roundtable.
I'm really thinking this is an idea. We can brainstorm another guest, but I think this is definitely a bigger topic, and I haven't done a roundtable in a while, so I think that's cool. Cathy Young, author of Ceasefire: Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve True Equality. Check her out on Your Reason magazine. You're writing for Heat Street. Do you have a website, or just follow you on Twitter?
I have a website that hasn't been updated in like ages and ages, and I'm really hoping to start doing something with it again. It is at cathyyoung.net. You can find a lot of my old stuff on it. But
so in the meantime, follow you on Twitter for your most recent articles.
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Cathy Young 63 on Twitter. So, that's where you can find all of my sort of new stuff. I'm writing for a lot of different places. Um, like I said, this is a cultural moment that seems to have been created to keep me extremely busy. So,
Glad to
uh,
hear that at least. Kathy,
I'm
thank you so
keeping up with
much.
it. I'm keeping up with it as best I can.
Yeah.
All
Thank
right.
you so
Well,
much,
thanks very
Kathy.
much. It's been a real pleasure to be here. And, we'll do this again sometime.